Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode. It's been a long time since I've posted a video, but we're back. So, let's get into the game. On this game, I started with the king's pawn opening pawn to e4. My opponent responded with the French defense with pawn to e6. Then I played pawn to d4, the center game. My opponent then played knight to e7. Then I played knight to f3, and then my opponent moved the knight again to g6. I don't recommend moving the same piece twice in an opening, so that's kind of an educational tip there. Try not to move the same piece twice in an opening unless that piece is being attacked. So after that, I played bishop to g5, attacking the queen. My opponent blocked with his own bishop. Then I went for the bishop exchange. Then I played pawn to e5, which is a mistake, but then my opponent missed that mistake and castled instead. The reason this is a mistake is because it wins the pawn. My opponent can play queen to b4 with a check, and then after I block this, my opponent can win this pawn. So hence that was a mistake. It wins a pawn. Then after that, I played bishop to d3. Then my opponent played pawn to d6, looking for the pawn exchange in the center. Then I castled the king side. Then my opponent played knight to d7 and did not take the pawn. Then I played rook to e1, increasing the protection of the pawn. And then my opponent went for that pawn exchange, and then I took back with the pawn. I just feel taking with the knight would have been taking with the pawn or with the knight is kind of the same thing for me. But then my opponent played pawn to b6. Then I played bishop to e4, attacking the rook. Then my opponent moved the rook out of the way because moving pawn here doesn't work, and moving bishop here also doesn't work. So the best move is to move the rook. Then I played bishop to c6. The reason this is a mistake and my opponent missed this mistake is because my opponent had to play rook to d8. Of course, there's an attack on the queen, and then after that I'll have to move my queen to e2 to remove it from being attacked by the rook. So after that, my opponent will have played queen to c5, and then after I move my bishop here or maybe here, which is the best square, is moving to e4, but any square it allows my opponent to win this pawn, and then I cannot go if I had moved my bishop to this side and try to go for this center fight, this would have been a brilliant move, because after I capture back with my knight and my opponent captures with the knight, I cannot capture with the queen because my opponent can do this, and then after this is checkmate. So moving bishop to the other side was also a big mistake. So the best move after, if my opponent had found that sequence there, was the only move that would have been bad for me was to lose the pawn. So moving the bishop to the other side was not good, but moving the bishop to this side, let me show you again. Let's go. No, let's not continue the game. After this, and then after this, moving the bishop to this side was the best move, even though I lose the pawn. So moving that bishop to the other side was going to lead to checkmate. So after I moved bishop to c6, my opponent then played knight to c5. Of course, I explained that miss. And then I played knight to c3. My opponent then played pawn to a6. Then I played pawn to b4, attacking the knight, trying to move it. Then my opponent played knight to b7. Then I played pawn to a3, protecting my pawn because it was under attack by the queen. Then my opponent played pawn to f6, looking for the pawn exchange, and then I played queen to e2, protecting my pawn. Then my opponent played knight to d8, and then I played bishop to e4, which is another mistake, and my opponent missed it again. So after my opponent played queen to f7, and then played bishop to g3. Then my opponent played bishop to b7, and then I took the pawn there, and then my opponent took back with the queen, and then I played knight to e4 attacking the queen, and my opponent took with the bishop, which is a mistake because it allows me to take back with the queen and protect my position and gives me an advantage. So, and also loses the pawn for my opponent. After my opponent played knight to f7, I can win this pawn, but then I just played queen to e6 first. Then my opponent didn't go for the exchange, instead moved king, which is a mistake. I just took the queen, and my opponent took back with the pawn. Then I took the knight. The reason this is a miss because I was winning this pawn, but then I saw that taking the knight gives me an advantage and on the attack of my opponent's king. And then my opponent, after capturing my bishop, I just played rook to e4. The best move was to play rook to e7, and of course this pawn can move in and captured. So after I played rook to e4, then my opponent played king to g8, removing the king away from the check or the threat of the check. Then I played knight to h4, attacking the pawn on g6. Then my opponent moved king to g7, which is the best move. Then I played rook to g4. Then my opponent made the mistake. The best move here was to play knight to e5, and now I had to move my rook because I cannot capture this pawn. The knight can capture back, so I had to move my rook maybe here or maybe back. Anyway, it works. But then my opponent missed this move, instead played knight to g5, and then I played pawn to f4, which is the best move, deflecting attacking the knight and removing it from the protection of the pawn. And then after the knight played to e6, I just took the pawn with the knight, which is the best move. Capturing with the rook is a big miss, but capturing with the knight is the best move because this attacks my opponent's rook. Then after my opponent moved the rook to c8, I played rook to e1, attacking the knight, and then my opponent moved king to f7. This is a pretty long game, so we're still going to go for a while until we reach the end game. So after my opponent played king to f7 and then played pawn to f5, attacking the knight, and then the knight had to move to g5. Then I played rook to e7 with a check, and then the king moved to g8, which is a forced move. And then I played rook to h4. I just feel like the best move was to play pawn to h4, but then I played rook to h4 first, and then my opponent played knight to f7, which is the best move. This prevents the checkmate. And then I played rook back, and then my opponent brought the knight back, and then played this pawn move now to h4. Then my opponent played rook to e8, and now my opponent is losing the knight, but this is apparently the best move. And then I just took, and for me taking is an inaccuracy. I should have taken here. And then after my opponent took it, I would have went for this check. Then my opponent tries anything or move knight to d5. So after I took the rook first, my opponent took back with the rook. Then I took the knight with the pawn. Then my opponent took back with the pawn. Then I took with the rook, and then we get into this interesting end game. Still a really long end game, but let's get into it. So after my opponent went for a check, I just played king to f2. My opponent then played rook to c1. Of course, I cannot protect that pawn. Instead, I played pawn to f6, which is an inaccuracy or a mistake. I shouldn't have moved that pawn. I should have moved the knight maybe, playing the discovered check. But then my opponent won the pawn, and then my opponent played king to f7, attacking my knight and my pawn, and then I had to choose one. Of course, I had to choose the knight. But the best move here was to play rook to f5, because after this I could have just moved was this a mistake maybe? Moving the pawn was the best move, because my opponent's king cannot capture the pawn, and instead can capture my rook, and then I can crown the queen and then win this game. So there was a faster way to win the end game. I just prolonged it. The reason I prolonged it is because I was also low in time, so I was looking at my time and didn't want to lose the game, so hence I didn't see this sequence. I probably would have seen it, but then I didn't see it because I was also low in time or on time. And then after my opponent attacked my knight and my pawn, I just moved the knight. Then my opponent took back with the king. Then I moved my rook to g3. My opponent played pawn to c5, and then I took back with my pawn, and then I played knight to d5 with a check. Then I played knight to c7. My opponent moved the pawn, and then I played pawn to e4, and then my opponent moved the other pawn to c4. Then I played knight to b5. My opponent played pawn rook to a2, attacking my pawn, and then I played rook to a3, protecting the pawn. Here I think I had 1 minute left, and then my opponent didn't take. Of course, if taking is losing the game, but then my opponent is still losing the game either way. So after my opponent moved rook to c2, I played rook to c3. Then my opponent didn't go for the exchange. The reason I repeated moves is because I was low in time, so I didn't know what to do. I was just thinking of another move, and then after that my opponent moved the rook to d2. I moved king to f1, and then my opponent moved king to e4. Then I went for this check, and then for another check. Then my opponent played king to c5. Then I played rook to a3. Then my opponent played rook to a2, and then I moved the pawn. Then I allowed that pawn to be captured. Then I moved my pawn forward, trying to crown, because now I think I was like at 40 seconds. My opponent moved rook to b4, looking to attack the pawn. Then I moved the pawn forward. My opponent moved rook to b7. Then I moved rook to g3, protecting the pawn. Then my opponent moved rook to g7. Then I played knight to f4, looking for the fork, and my opponent, I think he missed it, but my opponent was still high on time. I think it was like 3 minutes, but then my opponent missed this fork and then played pawn to f4. Of course, that is a mistake, and this allows me to win the rook. Then my opponent played pawn to c3, and of course I can capture this pawn, but this is a blunder because my pawn is too far away to crown before my opponent's pawn crowns. So if I play here, my opponent can play here, and then after that, even if I crown, my opponent can crown with a check, and then can play this end game. I'm still winning, but the advantage is really low. But then after I've won the rook, my opponent pushed the pawn. Here it was like meeting it. I think maybe playing check was another good move, but then I was focused on crowning and I was low on time, so I played knight to h5. My opponent played pawn to c2. Now I didn't care that my opponent is going to crown, because I saw that even if my opponent crowned, I still have pieces to fight off the queen. I instead pushed pawn, then my opponent crowned, then I moved king to g2, which is the best move. My opponent played queen to c2, then I moved king to h3. My opponent then played queen to c8. I thought my opponent was going to play queen to f5, but the best move was to play queen to h7. But then my opponent played queen to c8 with a check. Then I moved king to h4. Then my opponent played queen to g8, and then I played knight to f6. And then my opponent made another mistake. I don't understand why my opponent was making these mistakes, because my opponent was high on time, so he had all the time to think, but then my opponent just kept on making this mistake, and then from here the game was just over. I just crowned, and now that pawn is just too far away or too late to crown. Then I just played check, and then I went for this checkmate, simple checkmate, a knight and a queen, a rook and a queen. So that's how the game ended. So that was a pretty long game, and this is a long video. It's not that long, but it's a long video of me explaining this long game at 76 moves. So I think that's it, and that's how I executed my end game, even though I was really low on time. I think it was like on 10 seconds. I think that's all. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and until we see each other in the next video.